pick up a little bit sharp, because we've got two panels back to back in this session. The first panel is on women's travel writing, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this session. We've got three speakers, Emily Lethbridge, Hannah Armstrong and Zachary Melton. The first of which will be Emily with her paper entitled something that's not on the page that I can see, sorry. Mary Morris and Bertha. Excellent sharing. I know, right?
That's great, thank you very much. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. The title was the one thing I did manage to send in and get on the page. I did completely manage to fail to send any biographical information about myself and Zachary Melton, who will be speaking third, so apologies for that with the dark horses. But I work at the St Magnus Institute for Icelandic Research in Reykjavik, and I'm also an honorary fellow at the School of Geosciences in Edinburgh. My main job, I suppose, is looking after the Icelandic place name collection, amongst other things. So anyway, it's lovely to be here today. Please don't fall asleep after lunch. So let's go to Iceland, where we've been already yesterday, and where tourism, as I'm sure you all know very well, tourism and literary tourism really started. Tourism to Iceland began in the 19th century. Literary tourism was more of a phenomenon in the second half of the 19th century. And there's been a lot of work, scholarship, commentary, research, for the most part on accounts of travel to Iceland authored by men. Some of the most prominent of those being William Morris, who travelled to Iceland in the 1870s, William Gershom Collingwood, who went to Iceland in 1897. It's his book on the left, the cover of his and Jon Stefansson's book, came out in 1899. And then 20th century characters such as Lewis MacNeice and W.H. Auden. But many more women than might first be supposed sailed over northern waters, many of them from Leith, to Iceland. But very few of these women have had any real attention paid to them. So in a new project, a research project that Zachary and I are working on, it's a project called Kvennaspor, which means in Icelandic the tracks or the threads of women, unearthing and foregrounding women in Icelandic saga landscapes. We're attempting to fill in some of these gaps and rebalance the overall picture. In this talk, I will try within my allotted time to introduce two of the many, and I'll make a few remarks on the themes of environment, heritage and tourism on the basis of these two women's experiences of Iceland and their writing on the country. So, firstly, May Morris, who you'll see on the right here. May was born in 1862. She was the younger of the two daughters of Jane Morris, a well-known pre-Raphaelite model and muse, and her father was a man called William Morris. As such, May Morris grew up with a greater familiarity with Iceland than most people, I imagine. William Morris, of course, embarked on a project of translating the sagas together with an Icelander, Eiríkur Magnússon, from the 1860s onwards. The household was full of Icelanders came and went in the Morris household. Morris travelled to Iceland in the 1870s when May would have been around, she was born 62, so just 9 years of age. And so Iceland was a place with which May was very familiar, and not least familiar with the old saga heritage from her young years. There's a wonderful account in which she recalls being particularly enthused by Grettis saga, and on one occasion she climbed as a 10-year-old or something out onto the roof of Kelmscott Manor, the Morris country pad in Gloucestershire, and she climbed up to the gable of the roof and was trying to ride the roof in a manner similar to Glaumur in the Icelandic saga, but got stuck up there and had to be got down. She had a very successful professional career as a designer, designer of textiles, and she was head of the Morris & Co. embroidery company from the age of 23. She was an extremely accomplished embroiderer and producer, maker herself. She also taught, was one of the founding members of the Women's Guild of Crafts in 1907. She undertook the enormous editorial project of bringing William Morris's collected works to publication. This was 24 volumes published between 1910 and 1915. And she spent amongst them the Icelandic travel journals, William's travel journals, and his Icelandic saga translations. And she really spent the greatest part of her life preserving her father's memory and building up public recognition of his achievements. So what today, very much she was engaged in the project of emotional labour on behalf of her father. So happily though, in recent years she's been credited, she's becoming more of a familiar name in her own right and for her own achievements. The last 20 years of her life she spent living at Kelmscott Manor in Gloucestershire, originally leased by William Morris in the 1870s, later bought by Jane Morris after William Morris's death. So she moved there during the First World War and stayed there. Together with Mary Lobb, who was her partner for the last 20 years of her life, she embarked on annual summer trips all around the UK, including to Orkney a couple of times, the Hebrides, and amongst other locations to Iceland when she was in her 60s. And she went to Iceland 3 times, first in 1924, 1926 and 1931. Moving on to Bertha Surtees Philpotts, who you'll see on the left. Bertha was a little younger than May, born in 1877. Her mother was a linguist, though she'd not had any formal education herself, and her father was the headmaster of Bedford School for Boys. Bertha herself had just 1 year of formal education, but she nonetheless won a scholarship to Girton College, Cambridge, where she studied medieval and modern languages and got a first, although women, of course, were not awarded degrees at that time. She became a pioneer in women's education in the first decade of the 20th century, and she was, amongst other things, principal of the Women's College, Westfield College in London, 1919 to 21, and then mistress of Girton College in Cambridge from 1922 to 25, until she resigned to take care of her father, her mother having died, but she managed to continue lecturing and working for women's education within the university, and she died rather young at the age of 54 from cancer. She had a fairly prolific scholarly output, monographs and articles, and also a large number of unpublished materials, including letters and archives, letters, research notes and teaching materials that are in the Girton College archive in Cambridge. I forgot to say about May, the main source that I'll be drawing on is an absolutely extraordinary stash of diaries that May kept, recording all of the travels over these last 20 years of her life. And this was a collection of diaries that came to light in 2017 and were acquired by the Society of Antiquaries in 2018. Amongst them are very long and detailed descriptions of her Icelandic travels, which I've been transcribing and preparing for publication. So moving swiftly on. Begin with a few points of connection. I thought it might just be nice to draw attention to these. William Morris, I've mentioned already, obviously May's father, and Eiríkur Magnusson, William Morris's collaborator. Eiríkur Magnusson's wife was called Sigríður. Eiríkur and Sigríður moved from Iceland to England and were very familiar family. They were family friends of the Morrises. The connection with Bertha Philpotts is that she recalls having been given, aged 10 or so, a translation, William Morris and Eiríkur Magnusson's translation of Grettir Saga, which ignited her interest in Old Norse literature. It's a small world, that people who are interested in Iceland at that time, to some degree it still is, and so there are of course other shared acquaintances, and amongst those Sigfús Blöndal, the Icelander who edited the huge project Icelandic-Danish dictionary in the early 20th century and was based in Copenhagen. May Morris meets him on the boat in 1924 on the way over in June, and gets to know him. He also was a friend of Bertha Philpotts. Bertha spent a year or so in Copenhagen studying Danish and Icelandic there. Anna Bjarnadóttir Simonsson, another name I wanted to put up there. She was the first Icelandic woman to gain a degree abroad. She studied at Westfield College, where Bertha was principal, and she was the daughter of Bjarni Simonsson, who was a well-known 20th century Icelandic naturalist. And both Bertha and May were really, there's a lot of correspondence between them and the leading Old Norse intellectual figures of the time in Iceland and in Copenhagen. And finally, there are a couple of letters that I found between May and Bertha themselves. So I don't think that they weren't close acquaintances, they weren't friends, but they were certainly acquaintances. The materials I suppose we're looking at in May's case, they're diaries written up after the period of travel on the basis of notes that she took while travelling. In Bertha's case, it's more correspondence, descriptions of activities and places that we find in letters that she wrote to her family, particularly her siblings, and also to Eiríkur Magnusson, who taught Bertha Philpotts Icelandic at Girton College. I suppose it's useful to note that Bertha, although younger than May, gets to Iceland before May as a student. Bertha makes 6 trips between 1903 and 1914, pre-war, and May gets there only after the end of the First World War. And the First World War really, I think, is a watershed in Icelandic history. There's a lot of, it's a turning as more widely around Europe. And so these two accounts, not least, are interesting for the descriptive, the detail that they shed on pre- and post-war Iceland as a tourist destination. Other points of interest, it has to be emphasised from the outset that May and Bertha, they're obviously not the average tourist. They are vastly more well-informed and interested in all aspects of Icelandic history, culture, than the average tourist. And then, of course, there's also the gender perspective. As I mentioned already, these are extremely valuable accounts, detailed accounts of women travelling in their own right, not accompanying their husbands, but getting to Iceland under their own steam. So interesting for that reason. Yes, different kinds of sources though, in terms of the selection of detail they include. There are also visual dimensions to their records, so sketches and photographs. Now I've had 10 minutes, I guess. I kind of feel like you should be holding up I'd like a counting down timer. I'm so nervous about time. So these three themes, environment, heritage and tourism, both women obviously travel very extensively in most parts of Iceland, so they went much, much further afield than almost all other visitors. The landscape descriptions, especially in May Morris's accounts, are exceptionally detailed, and they're wonderful to read because she really has an artist's and a designer's eye, and she conveys the textures and the colours of places in a very immediate way. There's a very skillful draftsmanship in the way she draws the reader with her into the very heart of the natural settings she's experiencing and describing, so that lines and angles are accentuated and we see the play of light and shadow close up and at a distance. There's also always dialogue with her father. She's going to Iceland, following in her father's footsteps as a saga pilgrim, but as she becomes herself more familiar with Iceland and Icelanders, she really makes it her own. So certainly by 1931, she's absolutely seeing and conveying the Iceland that she's experiencing. She entitles her first glimpse of Iceland on the 21st of June 1924, Iceland First Seen, direct quotation, reference to her father's famous poem of the same name. And she writes, "Fog on and off the morning, 1:45 p.m, Iceland first seen. It was cold and fairly bright, with clouds and mist about. I was looking at the clouds on the horizon on the starboard bow, and there, in rents of the mist, grey-black and snow-white, huge and desolate, the mountains of the south. First, Mýrdalsjökull. It showed clearer and clearer, with a great glacier in front, white on black, slipping down to the deep blue of the water. Unimaginable, violent beauty of colour. The now flawless sky and ocean, the sunlit glitter of snow and the black rock. The mountains look huge, surprising and exciting. A giant country, distorted rock and frozen desert of snow. As we pass, left of Mýrdalsjökull comes the Eyjafjallajökull, and now on the right shows the great foss, Skógafoss, looking like a wide, white, perpendicular band dipping into the water. Riding into Þórsmörk, the reader's almost overwhelmed by the details from nature that May recalls and the rhythm of the passage. Oh my God, 5 minutes already. Okay, cut these quotations shorter then. So there's a huge amount of observation of nature, birds, flowers, really rich description. Weather and climate, notoriously subjective matter to assess in travel writing in certain respects, but since May and Bertha both visited Iceland on several occasions, they're sometimes in months at a time rather than weeks or days, they're aware to more of an extent of patterns of variation from one to the next, and they record local comments on the weather, unusually dry summers or snow that prevents them from undertaking the expeditions that they wish to. Human impact on the landscape pre and post-war is also a huge topic, and here I'll limit my comments to where you see this wonderful photograph of an incongruous car in the Icelandic landscape. By the time May gets to Iceland in 1924, the car is, it's not ubiquitous, but they're driven to Þingvellir, and she struggles with this kind of clashes with her idea of Iceland as the home of the saga heroes and her father's perspectives, but she reconciles herself to it. Had a wonderful quotation from Bertha about the difficulties of walking on beveled roads in Icelandic skin shoes, and how at that moment you do feel very grateful for a heel on your boot, but I'll skip over that and move to heritage. Heritage, of course, is the major draw for both of them, specifically the saga sites. And here, as regard to their descriptions of the saga sites, it's very hard for all of these travellers, I think, to not slip into this naive view of the Icelandic landscape as an untouched, frozen in time. You know, you just have to look behind a rock and one of the saga heroes will leap out at you. So they both articulate their experiences along these lines. They're interested in many other aspects of heritage too, architecture and traditional crafts and ways of making. Particularly May, of course, is fascinated in the textiles, the processes of making, the vocabulary of making, and makes detailed notes on these aspects. Finally, tourism. It's interesting looking at these accounts and considering, you know, the trajectory of tourism as a growing industry in Iceland 100 years ago, as well as, you know, the problems and challenges that it brings with it today. So Iceland at the time, pre and post-war, really was a society that was coming rapidly into contact, greater and greater contact with people from outside, trading reciprocally, a hub for the movement of people, goods and ideas and social movements across the Atlantic. It's important to note, I think, that both May and Bertha regard themselves, they consider themselves something other than tourists, as many travellers, trying to get that authentic description will. They do have access to Icelandic homes from the outset and a network of Icelandic friends and acquaintances. But there's a bit of a tension. They're sort of part of the development of tourism themselves, but they place themselves outside of it. There's some superiority in May Morris's descriptions or slight disapproval of the behaviour of other tourists, super rich tourists flying across Iceland from one side to the other to get a haircut, or guests at the new hotel at Thingvellir being offended by the lack of silver tableware. So there is a bit of an agenda there. And I wonder also, we've been talking yesterday and today about trying to open up perspectives, and looking at these accounts, we are opening up perspectives, and these are new views, but I think the least amount of work has been done on Icelandic perspectives and responses to the incoming tourists. So that's something that has yet to be explored. I'll be delighted to hear this is my final slide. I think maybe I have about 30 seconds. I just wanted to end by making some rather general points about gaps in the record. What survives? How much is this chance? To some degree, yes, it's very coincidental what we have. And of the 6 volumes of Icelandic travel that we have, that we know May wrote, only 5 of those exist. So we're missing half of her 1926 description, May Morris's. We know also that she made many, many drawings. We have some of them, found some of them in archives, but most of them have disappeared, as well as the watercolours that she made. Bertha talks about sketching, taking photographs. I imagine she wrote a diary, but there's no trace of these materials, so where they've gone is anyone's guess. To some degree, what ends up in an archive, is due to whoever finds it, or people's perception of the importance of documents for the future. But there is also a question of, more conscious erasure or deliberate erasure, and this is a question of whose voices are heard, whose documents are, preserved or prioritised, even accredited or discredited. And here I mention one of the oldest female travellers to Iceland comes to mind, an Austrian woman called Ida Pfeiffer, travelled to Iceland in the 1840s, and according to her and her account, she climbed up Hekla, but in several of the male-authored accounts of travel to Iceland that post-date hers, they'll refer to her account, and a lot of them tend to discredit her claim that she went up Hekla. Just, she gets the landscape wrong. She couldn't have, she as a woman, she couldn't have done that. So that there is also there's that pushback. So for me, this project in general is very much about identifying the dynamics that drive the bigger narratives and assumptions, and also trying to use opportunities where we can to identify and fill in gaps, even subvert the dominant narratives, in academic contexts and beyond, using all of the tools that we have at our disposal, and not least creative ones, to engage the attention of the wider public and encourage individuals to reassess or reconfigure basic assumptions in inequalities. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Please do.
Okie dokie. Well, firstly, I'd like to start by thanking the organisers of the conference for the opportunity to speak today, as well as to Emily and Zachary for inviting me to be a part of their panel. The paper I am presenting today comes from my PhD thesis, which, broadly speaking, looks at the reception of Old Norse literature by British writers between the 19th and 21st centuries, with a particular interest in their depictions of the islands of the North Atlantic. This paper is specifically from my chapter on travellers to Iceland, and following on from Emily's brilliant presentation, looks at another female traveller in Iceland in the summer of 1931, and her name was Alice Selby, and you can see her on the screen here. So one of the reasons I've chosen to focus on Selby today, but also my thesis, is because I'm interested in the ways that she resists many of the conventions of saga pilgrimage and the accounts we have about saga travel. As we shall see, her relationship with the landscapes of Iceland was sort of not as clear-cut one of sort of reverence and awe as we might often see with other saga pilgrims, nor was her engagement with the island's literary heritage as immediately apparent, despite her expertise in the area, which is something I'll get into a bit more in a moment. So I'm going to begin by really briefly sketching a bit about what we know of Selby's life, as it's unlikely that she'll be a familiar figure to many in the room today. So Alice Selby was born in 1895 as the last of 6 children to the prominent Wesleyan minister and missionary Thomas Gunn Selby and his wife Catherine. Selby Sr. was an important figure within the Wesleyan ministry and who also published extensively both works of theology but also translations of Chinese folk tales which he encountered during his time as a missionary in the Guangdong province. The family was clearly quite an affluent one, living in a large house in Bromley, London, with 2 domestic servants, and it seems to have been a household in which academic pursuits were encouraged. The local newspapers, for instance, record the subject prizes won by the Selby siblings at school, and William, the only son, won 2 scholarships to study at Trinity College, Cambridge. Of the 6 children, I've been able to find evidence for 5 of them attending university, which is quite an unusual state of affairs at a time when there were only around 14,000 full-time university students in England, of which only 2,000 were women. So in 1913, Alice takes up a place reading English at Newnham College, Cambridge, where her older sister Catherine is already studying. She achieved a first class in her final exams, but as we've already heard, she couldn't formally graduate, as women couldn't graduate from the University of Cambridge until 1948. And then Selby spends a term studying anthropology under the influential ethnologist A.C. Haddon before taking up a position at University College Nottingham, now known as the University of Nottingham, where she spends the rest of her career teaching medieval literature and languages. Much of what is known of her later life is taken from the personal recollections of a former student, which were included at the end of her posthumously published Icelandic journal, which you can see on the right-hand side here. So to summarise what's already quite brief material, we know that Selby rose to be a senior lecturer, and during the early years of the Second World War was head of the department. During this period, she also accidentally discovered the remains of a lost medieval village, whilst digging new vegetable allotments to support the war effort. And in 1951, Selby retires from lecturing and spends the rest of her life in her adopted village of Knifeton until her death in 1973. So it's the following year that her only publication, that I'm aware of at least, and there's the possibility there's like a stray article out there somewhere in an unsearchable venue, but as far as I know, her only publication, Icelandic Journal, comes out posthumously in 1974, published by the Viking Society for Northern Research, after the manuscript was brought to the Society's attention by Selby's older sister Dorothea, and is still available to purchase from the Society, or you can read it for free on their website if I've piqued your interest. So, having introduced Alice Selby and her biography, I will now turn more firmly to her Icelandic journal and its account of her 1931 journey to Iceland. So, for those who travelled to Iceland in the 19th and 20th centuries to see its saga-related sites and who then wrote about their experiences, it's quite typical of them to offer their reasoning or motive for their travels at the beginning of their texts. So I'm giving 2 kind of brief examples here. On the left, we have Sabine Baring-Gould, who would go on to become a prominent Victorian Gothic novelist, amongst many other things. And he writes in his 1863 Iceland, Its Scenes and Sagas, that, quote, "My object in visiting Iceland was twofold. I purposed examining scenes famous in saga and filling a portfolio with watercolour sketches." So that's nice and straightforward. My other example, Elizabeth Jane Oswald, visited the country on a number of occasions and helpfully opens her 1882 text by Fell and Fjord, or Scenes and Studies in Iceland, with a chapter titled Why We Go There. As Oswald puts it, every year a few people go now to Iceland for their summer holidays. They are generally drawn there by one of 3 attractions: the fishing, the geology, or the old literature. It was the literature that brought me. the vivid sagas which set the men and women of the past before us as if we had known them ourselves. From Selby, we receive no such raison d'etre, no explicit statement that it was the literature that brought her, which in turn raises the question of why, and indeed if, we should perhaps include her in discussions about saga pilgrims. So why might we do this? Well, from her biography, we know that Selby was an expert in Old Norse literature. Indeed, in the personal recollections at the end of Icelandic Journal from her former student, G.R. Hibbard, he notes that of all the subjects she taught, this, that is Old Norse literature, was the closest to her heart. Hibbard goes on to reflect that, quote, practical, competent, efficient though she was, she also had something of the romantic in her. She delighted in the extreme individualism of the saga heroes. Their adventurous journeys struck an answering chord in her, and she admired the ethos that prompted their last stands. The journey she had recently made to Iceland had evidently not been without its sentimental, in the very best sense of that word, motives and overtones. So this sort of posthumous editorialising prompts us to see Selby's journey as a kind of saga pilgrimage. Indeed, the fact that Selby's Icelandic Journal was published by the Viking Society for Northern Research, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but for those who aren't, is a learned society dedicated to the study of Old Norse literature and culture. This also aligns her journey and its account with the interests of saga readers and scholars. So Selby may not situate herself within the tradition of saga travel, but the editing of her journal certainly does. Within the text itself, there is a real ambivalence towards the medieval past. In fact, there are moments, a number of moments in which attempts to recreate or memorialise Iceland's saga age is depicted as a foolhardy experience, or exercise, that is. So, for instance, Selby recounts a tale she hears whilst in Reykjavik about the recent 1,000-year celebration of the establishment of the Alþingi, Iceland's parliament. I heard a funny story, Selby writes, of the horse fight that was to be shown at the millenary celebrations. There were many protests against the revival of this barbarous form of sport, but because it was traditional and of the saga age, the fight was held. But when the ponies were put to it, instead of biting with concentrated hatred, they rolled and played like a couple of puppies. The promoters of the fight had unfortunately picked on two firm friends who enjoyed a good romp together. Another incident near the beginning of the journal recounts an unusual encounter in Iceland's capital, which I think is worth quoting at length. I had hoped, but not expected, Selby writes, to find gaily dressed Vikings striding the streets of Reykjavik. So when I looked around at the clatter of hooves and saw a romantic figure on a horse, I felt that I was back in the saga age. The man was gold-helmeted and scarlet-cloaked, he had a red beard and his blue trousers were laced with gold thongs. He had a gold spear in his hand and a dog at his side. It was later that I learnt how the Viking got his outfit. There is a movement for restoring the national costume, but this ideal gets no more sympathy from the majority of people in Reykjavik than does the dress reform movement from most Londoners. So as a protest against this freak ideal, some bright young people clubbed together and bought a complete Viking outfit. They gave this to a harmless lunatic who hangs about the town and flaunts his finery to the surprise and delight of foreigners. Apart from this touch of medievalism, Reykjavik is no more romantic than any other town. Now, as much as I enjoy Selby's writing, I do always find this passage a little bit mean-spirited, perhaps, but I think it really demonstrates how little time Selby had for overt displays of historical nostalgia. Incidentally, the Icelandic Journal's editor, A.R. Taylor, who was a former president of the Viking Society, has identified this modern-day Viking as one Oddur Sigurgeirsson, and a photo of him in his regalia can be found in W.H. Auden and Lou McNeice's famous 1937 travelogue, Letters from Iceland, or at least in the early editions. And he actually seems to have been something of a well-known figure in Reykjavik in the 1930s and 40s. And if you look online, there are a couple of examples of Oddur in his Saga Age clothing, as you can see on the right-hand side here. So, having been unmoved by these attempts at recreating the past, in what ways can we see Selby engaging with Iceland's literature and medieval heritage in her text, as surely a lecturer of Old Norse literature must in some way? Well, the moment in which she perhaps most conforms to the conventions of the literature of saga pilgrimage is when she is travelling through the north of Iceland and stays for a week at the home of a local priest. During her time there, Selby recounts regularly riding up and down the valley as, quote, I wanted to see the places mentioned in the Saga of the Men of Svartfadadal. This urge to see the specific locations of particular sagas, so in this case Svartdala saga, is emblematic of saga pilgrimage as a travel writing genre, as we've already kind of heard partly from Emily's paper. But we can also see it in other texts, such as Sabine Baring-Gould, who I mentioned earlier. Baring-Gould, like May Morris, was a big fan of Grettir's saga, and it was a text he returned to throughout his long life. So in his Scenes and Sagas, he mentions many occasions on which he visits sites that are connected to Grettir's saga, including Grettir's alleged family home, of which Baring-Gould remarks that, quote, I stood on the rocky platform in front of the house to survey the landscape of which Grettir's eyes must have roamed so often. Beyond it swelled up the heath over which lies the road traversed by Grettir when he rode to avenge his brother's murder. So for Baring-Gould, these are kind of highly emotive landscapes, but in Selby's rides through Svartfadadala, we see no such matching up of place and historical event. She only notes that, quote, she wanted to see the places mentioned in the saga. Furthermore, Svartdala saga is quite an unusual saga for a pilgrim to pursue, as it is one of these so-called post-classical sagas, which were written in approximately the 14th and 15th centuries, and which have, to quote Rebecca Merkelbach, generally been relegated to the sidelines of scholarship, as their stylistic difference was perceived as a form of corruption and degeneration of supposedly pure Icelandic storytelling tradition. A post-classical saga would therefore be quite, shall we say, avant-garde choice for a pilgrim to pursue, and this particular one is also highly fragmentary, with large lacunas in its narrative. And I think I'm right in saying that at the time of Selby's trip it wasn't available in English yet either. So whether Selby was particularly fond of or interested in this saga, or whether it was just in the vicinity of where she happened to be, is unclear. But aside from Thingvelli and the site of the Alþingi, it's the only saga site she expressly notes exploring. The journal also records, for instance, that she stayed a night at Hrafnkelstaðir, but no mention is made of the farm's connections to Hrafnkel saga. Perhaps then Selby's greatest deviation from the conventions of saga pilgrimage and its attendant writing tradition is not in what she does do, but rather in what she doesn't. So on the penultimate page of the journal, Selby laments that, quote, I had left undone many of the things I had meant to do. I had no time to visit Hekla and the geysers, to see the waterfall Gullfoss, and the thing I regret most, to visit Hidarendi, where the brave Gunnar of Njal's saga lost his life. For 19th century saga travellers, such an omission from their itinerary would have been unthinkable, as Njal's saga was then, and indeed probably to some extent is now, the most famous and generally beloved of the Icelandic sagas. So if you were going to go to Iceland to see saga sites, you were going to go and see the sites associated with Njal's saga. To give a sense of the dedication of previous scholars to seeing these landscapes, William Morris remarked in his Icelandic journals that he was, quote, quite ready to be drowned in the Markfleet, that is the anglicised name of one of the rivers which flows through so-called Njál country. So determined was he to reach these holy places of Iceland, to again quote Morris. But Selby, although she clearly regrets not finding time for Hidarendi, didn't see it as a priority of her trip. So to kind of round off my discussion of Selby's attitude towards the Icelandic saga landscape and heritage, I'd like to briefly note that, unlike May Morris, Selby had no qualms about being driven by car to Thingvelli, and indeed, after a long day of hiking in the east of the country, she recounts that on seeing, quote, a nice green petrol pump at the side of the road, I nearly threw my arms around it, as I felt it was a messenger from the great civilised world of baths and tramcars. As we previously saw in her attitude to saga age, costume and entertainment, Selby was not interested in recreating or trying to sort of quote-unquote more authentically engage with Iceland's medieval heritage. So, though to be clear, she does do plenty of riding and seems to enjoy it. She has no compunctions about taking modern forms of travel when available. When I've previously discussed Selby and her journal with colleagues, they've sometimes asked me, did she actually enjoy her time there? As I think I often linger on the things that she didn't do or that she pushes back against. But the answer is definitely yes. Selby fell in love with Iceland, and she even jokes about retiring to the north of the country and snubbing all of the English tourists that pass through. And it isn't that she entirely eschews all engagement with the sagas. So returning perhaps to her interest in anthropology, it is often through the people she encounters that Selby finds connections with the past. Yeah. So to give one such example, Selby remarks of the mother of an Icelandic friend that, quote, "The old lady is like a woman of the sagas and will keep control of her household in her wrinkled hands to the very last. Suitably enough, she is a sort of curator in the Museum of Antiquities, and in her the visitor will see a much more potent reminder of the days of old than in the woven and embroidered fabrics that moulder in the glass cases with a scent of mothball." To Selby, then, it is the people of Iceland who are the keepers and conduit to its medieval heritage. Going on what you said previously, yesterday and today, I wonder if you might now describe her as being interested in more like intangible heritage, certainly more so than its saga sites and landscapes. So as I move towards wrapping up, you may recall that the title of this paper referred to Selby's accounts plural. And this is because another record of Selby's journey survives in the special manuscript collection at the University of Nottingham, and it's the paper diary that Selby took with her as she travelled around Iceland. Incidentally, we're not actually quite sure how it ended up there, other than her connections that she worked there. We don't know at what point it ended up there. That's something I'm still trying to get to the bottom of. As a text, it's a far more immediate and raw response to her experiences of the country, and it includes things like where she's jotting down sums as she works out how she can make her money last long enough for the trip. And to outline all the differences between the two versions would likely be an entire paper in itself. But what I would like to note today are the ways in which this text reminds us that all narratives of saga pilgrimage are carefully constructed responses to a genre, and are far from being kind of innate responses by the writers to their encounters with Iceland's landscape and heritage. Rather, they are often in conversation with each other, and like every genre, have formal and thematic expectations. Reading Selby's text in parallel reminds us how much polishing, how much focusing of the lens happens between diary and published travelogue, with even the order of events sometimes being rearranged or even expunged. Perhaps the most surprising difference between Selby's texts, for me at least, was my discovery that the anonymous Anglo-American caravan of women who Selby briefly mentions in her published journal is actually May Morris and Mary Loeb. Selby doesn't seem to have taken to the pair, and rather acidly writes of Morris in her diary that, quote, "She has vague Old Norse interests, was lulled to sleep with the sagas, suckled on Magnussons," that's William Morris's translation partner, "but obviously knows no more about them than less fortunate people." It's probably a good thing that didn't make it into the final cut. So I really will finish and kind of wrap up now. But I hope my paper and my discussion of Selby has complicated and, dare I say the dreaded word, problematized our understanding of what it means to engage in saga pilgrimage. And I hope to have, however briefly, have drawn attention to this funny, practical, at times acerbic, and clearly academically brilliant woman. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for having me, and thank you for staying and listening. My name is Zachary Melton, and I work on the project with Emily Kvennesborg, and today I just want to tell you a little bit about my role in that project and talk about one of the interesting themes that has popped up and taken an unexpected turn when exploring that theme. Kvennesborg, unearthing and foregrounding women in Icelandic saga landscapes, and my role in this project has been to collect as many narratives, you've heard about a lot today, written by foreign women coming and traveling in Iceland. And through this, I've started to create a database with all of these women, even if it was a short newspaper article or a lengthy journal like we see with Selby. All the women you've heard today will be on the database, and we have their names, a short biography, the dates in which they were in Iceland, as well as sort of a network of who they were meeting, different guides and hosts that they came across who was in Iceland at the same time. And this research has brought up a lot of very interesting things so far. About a month or so ago, I presented with Emily and Ingebjörg about the role the social club in the United States played in understanding Iceland, so tourists would come to Iceland and come back to present in their local literary clubs as experts on Iceland and Iceland culture. But today I'm going to continue a theme from yesterday and talk about alcohol. And what is interesting is this, there's an interesting intersection in this sort of cultural heritage that we've been talking about, where a lot of these ideas on alcohol come from outsiders. So we've been looking at these travel narratives and their discussion of alcohol and temperance and prohibition. And there seems to be very different ideas along gender lines. So a lot of the men that came had a very different experience with alcohol. So we see Lord Dufferin, who we heard about yesterday, come in 1857, who apparently did not drink all that often, but went to a party and decided to be respectable and polite. So he said, I cheeked my first bumper against his, and having emptied it, turned it towards him bottom upwards with an orthodox twist. Soon things began to look more serious even than I expected. I knew well that to refuse a toast or to half empty your glass was considered churlish. I was willing at a pinch. Should he not be content with me seeing me at his table, I was ready, if need were, to remain under it. Frederick Metcalf says that my host seduced me into a second glass of brandy with the proverb which he cites, a fish ought always to swim twice, once when he is alive and once when he is dead. And you can't, unfortunately, see the William Morris quote, but he says that coming to Kramer, a lovely homestead, we were offered the inevitable coffee and brandy. So this was a common theme with the men, that brandy was present in most cases. William Morris also has a really great anecdote when one of his guides gets drunk and then later pretends to be a different person with a bottle, hoping that William Morris will refill it. But the women, on the other hand, have a very different perspective. The aforementioned Ida Pfeiffer in 1845 says, a besetting sin of the Icelanders is their drunkenness. Their poverty would probably not be so great if they were less devoted to brandy and worked more industriously. I am, however, happy to say I never saw a woman in this degrading condition. Elizabeth Jane Oswald in 1875, the Icelanders are a very law-respecting nation. Crime is rare, and what little there is has generally something to do with brandy. And she also says that she does not see women drinking, and in fact, women are free from the three drawbacks which afflict the men. They do not drink, they do not chew tobacco, and they do not fidget. And Adelia Gates, who travels to Iceland in 1893, sorry, these slides are a little goofy. She refers back to this episode with Lord Dufferin, and she says, observe the sufferings of Lord Dufferin upon the altar of hospitality. He was made to drink so many toasts at the governor's dinner that he fairly lost his head, and afterwards he went to hunt rabbits with pink noses, only to discover that they were birds and not rabbits, which we must conclude that he honored too many toasts. This is not clearly down gender lines. We have a handful of women that came that drank wine or spirits or partook, in celebrations without really mentioning it or incident. And then my hero, Arthur Middleton Reeves, who is from my home state, came to Iceland in 1879, who was also very critical of alcohol. And he says, it is their besetting sin, reminding us of Ida Pfeiffer's words. And it comes doubtless from their manner of life, the entire lack of excitement, the humdrum monotony of an existence, which offers no incentive to improvement. And this leads us into the 20th century, when two women with very opposing ideas came in 1907. One you see here was Annie Lemp Konta, who was the daughter of a beer brewer in St. Louis, Missouri, that at the time was the rival of Anheuser-Busch, which would go on to produce Budweiser and the famous American beers. And she wrote in 1915, after her trip to Iceland, this wonderfully titled, A Plea for Moderation Based Upon Observations of a Woman in a Belligerent Country. And this was sort of in defense of German families, especially German brewing families in the area during this anti-German sentiment in World War I. Whereas Gertrude Austin, who was here at the exact same time, says there has been a great deal of drunkenness in Iceland, but a law has been recently passed forbidding the importation of alcohol. And she's referring to, she's writing this in around 1908. And so around that time there was a referendum in Iceland about whether or not they should move forward with prohibition. And it's a little controversial about the results of that referendum, but they went ahead and total prohibition came to Iceland in 1915. It was repealed not long after that, except for beer, which was illegal in Iceland until 1989. But I kind of want to go back, sorry for the chronological mess, but kind of go back in time to the beginnings of the temperance movement and the prohibition movement, which came from outside sources. This building that you see here is in Akureyri in the north of Iceland, and this is where the Independent Order of the Good Templars met, beginning in 1884. And this is around the time when temperance really started to take root in Iceland. This building is now the Toy Museum in Reykjavik, which explains this little guy here. And on the other side, we see a newspaper article which states that women are the forerunners of the temperance movement. This is in 1890, and that things are starting to look up. The crime rate is going down, which reflects sort of what Elizabeth Jane Oswald was complaining about. And so we see temperance moving forward, and we see that women are in the foreground of this movement, which brings us to 1895, when 3 American women come to Iceland, Jessie Ackerman, Nana Pratt, and Ruth Schaffner, as part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which had 2 goals, which was to eradicate alcohol, but also to support women's suffrage. And so women's rights and temperance had this interesting relationship, and they came to set up a chapter of the WCTU here, in Iceland. And we know about this from Jessie Ackerman's articles in this journal, which is the Ladies' Home Companion. She wrote 3 articles about her travels. A really wonderful, the first article really describes the Faroe Islands in a really wonderful way. Jessie Ackerman was a missionary for the WCTU who had at this point traveled all over the world and set up WCTU chapters in China, Japan, South Africa, Burma, and India. She's particularly remembered in Australia for her work towards women's suffrage there. And she decides to come to Iceland in 1895, in part because the WCTU asked her to. She also was going on behalf of the Ladies' Home Companion to write a piece about Iceland. And the doctors told her that her failing health would improve getting to Iceland, which is, interesting now when I'm living there and getting a cold every week. And she wrote this book, The World Through a Woman's Eyes, published 1896, the year after she went to Iceland. And unfortunately, Iceland doesn't make it into this book, and so we miss out on the northern travels that she had. While they were in Iceland, they climbed a mountain simply to plant a WCTU banner. I'm not sure which mountain that is, trying to figure that out. And they set up a Women's Christian Temperance Union chapter with the Icelandic member Ólafía Jóhannsdóttir, who is a very famous woman in Icelandic history for her push for women's rights in the 19th century. And Interestingly, similar to Alice Selby not mentioning the sagas, Jessie Ackerman doesn't really mention alcohol all that much in her journals. But we do have this wonderful moment at the end of their journeys where they meet with some government officials, and he toasts the women with lemonade. She makes sure to make that clear. There was no alcohol. And he says, when the Vikings left Iceland in the early centuries and first landed in America, they were set forth to conquest with sword and returned in blood. But these Viking women from America came with a stronger weapon than sword or spear, the mightiest weapon ever wielded, love. They came in love and returned in victory, for they have conquered. This already has some interesting gender overtones, of course, and the men are certainly not talked about in this way. And here's where the unexpected connection comes in, and we see a different perspective on cultural heritage. That Nana Pratt of this trio was the daughter of Richard Henry Pratt, a lieutenant colonel who founded the Carlisle Industrial Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And if you don't know, the Indian schools in American history, both in Canada and the United States, is a very dark moment in our history. They were set up to remove all heritage from the American Indians, the indigenous people, and to make them assimilate into Western white culture. Ruth Schaffner, who came to Iceland with this group, she was a teacher at that school. And Jessie Ackerman dedicated her book, The World Through Woman's Eyes, to Richard Henry Pratt. And his motto at the school and through his work was, kill the Indian, save the man. Ruth Schaffner, the year after she comes back from Iceland, published an article civilizing the American Indian. And here we have just a really interesting question of, are these sort of two sides of the same coin, pushing towards civilization? What Ruth says in this article, she's trying to be benevolent. And if you step back and look at what she's trying to say, is that these schools are a far better alternative to what was happening to many indigenous people, which was annihilation and genocide. However, they were simply losing their culture through this. Richard Henry Pratt adopted WCTU textbooks, and we have Henry William Blair, who was a really early prohibition activist in the United States, that he saw alcohol as the foe of civilization and argued that the doctrine or duty of total personal abstinence is one of Christian civilization. So we have sort of, in both temperance and in this Indian school, this sort of betterment, or this goal of creating a better civilization, both by civilizing the Indians and by eradicating alcohol so that we can create a Christian civilization. Lots of problems with this, of course. Now here's where things get interesting in regards of our conversations yesterday, is that Olavia Johansdóttir comes to Carlisle, to the Indian school, later in the century, around 1897. And she, in her biography, says that Olivia writes how she woke up one night and Mrs. Pratt was woken up by a noise that came find Indian students outside dancing and hollering, celebrating the full moon. Mrs. Pratt told them that Daddy Pratt, which is what they called him, which is very strange, would not like that. They needed to sleep at night like other people. But still, Pratt saved a lot of Indian tribes from annihilation, but they lost their culture in the process. And this is not an autobiography. This is written by an Icelandic woman whose name I'm going to forget right now. But this is the author of the biography trying to wrestle with this, not Olavia herself. And on the other side of the screen, this is the Carlisle Indian School newspaper, the Indian Helper, again, these problematic names, in which Olavia presents on Iceland while she's there. And so, in a very strange way, we have someone from the north, the European north, the Arctic even, if you want to call Iceland that, present at a moment when we were witnessing the loss and the erasure, the active erasing of cultural heritage in the of an entire group of people. And to bring this back full circle, in researching this, I discovered a poem written by a student at the Carlisle Indian School as if she had gone to Iceland. This is clearly informed by the talks given by Jesse Ackerman and Ruth Schaffner and even Olavia. And see if I can read it for you. I come from the Northern Isle, far off in the Arctic Sea, where legend and myth beguile, and a fairy land have we. So she's talking in first person as if she's there, and she's Icelandic. I come from Iceland's shore to bring you greetings true to Susan, Standards Galore, and Brave Invincibles too. These were groups of students at the school. They were called Susans, which Olavia had addressed when she was there. Great lava beds, moss adorned, sweet wildflowers found everywhere, chasing where the wind had mourned, and waterfalls sparkling fair. Most glorious is our sky, our sunset pastures most rare. When day is about to die, gently passes daydreams fair. For 1,000 years and more, our island, man's history and nature's handiwork bore a field for rich reverie. Norway's lordly Vikings came when our land was clothed in ice to herald my country's fame, and thither oppressed men enticed. They gave our isles wintered name Iceland, though from southern seas mild waves to us ever come, fanned by many a gentle breeze. You should ever remember here Iceland's voyagers, so bold, first discovered in a day's drear America, so we're told. And this is an indigenous person talking about this, the first people to discover America as Vikings. Very interesting. A simple people are we, living in that far-off land, loyal to our country, a small, peaceful, joyous band. An Arctic expedition came to us at Reykjavik with a daring tradition and rode thence to Capervik. I'm not sure what place that would be. Plucky leader of this band was Miss Jessie Ackerman, and Miss Schaffner, her right hand, with Miss Pratt comprised the clan. 2 months in our land they stayed, speaking temperance far and wide, many converts for us made, and made stronger our own side. Come sisters, join me in song, sing Iceland's melody here, let Carlisle remember long our visit and song so dear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zachary. Could I ask our speakers to join me in the front and then we can take questions?
What's that?